right now. All right.
Good morning, everyone. I want to first thank you for joining us for the Environment Initiative Research webinar today as part of the UO's Week of Research. In particular, I want to thank the UO's Vice President for Research, Kaz Mosley, and her office for inviting us to participate in this week's events. I'm Adell Amos, the Executive Director of the University of Oregon's Environment Initiative. I'll tell you more about that initiative in just a minute. But before I do, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this region. As you will in a minute, our Environment Initiative is guided by a set of principles that include a commitment to social and environmental justice and amplifying and respecting voices that have often been left out of these conversations. As such, our commitment to the traditional ecological knowledge held by Indigenous people of this region and many regions resonates deeply. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Alihi, the traditional Indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their Indigenous homeland by the US government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the land that we now refer to as Oregon, and to the world. As our Indigenous neighbors, colleagues, and friends may know best, we are in the amid unprecedented and transformative environmental change. As our world makes clear, we face a set of related and integrated challenges: the effects of global climate change, the impacts of structural racism, increased economic insecurity, and the public health outfall of a global pandemic. All of us, especially our students, are facing dramatic ecological shifts to our natural systems because of climate change and other forces. As a result of these challenges, we are experiencing societal paradigm shifts in systems that govern our economy, our natural world, the built environment, democracy, and fundamental relationships among people. Shifts that will guide the future, social justice dynamics, and environmental equities that shape our world. Higher education has the opportunity to organize itself to contribute more meaningfully and directly to these challenges, and to prepare our students for building a more just and livable future. Our initiative here at the University of Oregon is designed to do just that. In launching our efforts, we have been guided by a set of principles, and we try to ensure our work is multidisciplinary and innovative in finding opportunities for teaching, research, and service. This means making connections across traditional disciplinary silos to focus more on problems rather than content areas. We strive to have our work be policy relevant, applied, translational, and responsive to the urgency of our environmental challenges. The hope here is to generate knowledge and insights that can be put to use outside the academic context, those insights in time for them to matter. Our work, we try to have our work rooted and focused on issues of equality, equity, and social and environmental justice, in which we add and amplify voices to this conversation. This means intentionally and repeatedly asking ourselves who is included and who is not, and working towards more inclusion and equity. The hope is that our work is relevant and responsive to the needs of the state, the ecoregion, and beyond. The goal here is to build reciprocal relationships with community, with government, and with partners outside the university setting. And then finally, the work is tied to direct student outcomes, experiential learning offerings, and new ways of thinking about professional pathways for this changing world. This means asking ourselves, what must our students understand and be able to do to live in this emerging world and help forge a better one? The Environment Initiative is committed to supporting teaching, research, and engagement in a multidisciplinary context to do work that helps us create a more just and livable future. While a university-wide initiative is new, the UO has a long-standing tradition of engagement on environmental issues. Today, we've gathered just a few of the many faculty members from across UO schools and colleges to talk about how their research responds to this set of guiding principles that we've set out. Each of these faculty members engages in research and teaching that reflects these principles, and you'll hear about that today. And our hope is that you leave this session inspired by what's possible here at the UO. I know I am inspired by the work, by getting to work with all of them. So just a few reminders from me before we begin. The session is being recorded and will be available on the VPRI's YouTube channel in coming days. I think it's being live streamed there now too. We can drop the link in the chat maybe. The presentations will be presented each and will likely generate more questions from you in the audience. We will hold those questions till the end. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function. Jill Elizabeth, the project management for this endeavor, will be moving us along from speaker to speaker and will help moderate our questions at the end. Jill, with that, welcome everybody once again, and I will hand this off to you.
Thank you so much for starting us out, Professor Amos. Our first speaker today is Dr. Lauren Hallett. Dr. Hallett, I'll turn it over to you to talk about how your research embodies these guiding principles.
Great, thank you so much, Jill and Adele. It's been a real pleasure to put this together. And today I'd like to talk about some of the work from my group on translational ecology in action. I'm an assistant professor in the biology department and the environmental studies program. So the goal of the Hallett Lab is to produce usable science to improve environmental management. And this is a big goal, but it's also fairly vague. What is usable? And I think what is usable really comes down to what we value. So for example, my training has been as a grassland ecologist. I work a lot in these systems. These are serpentine grasslands. They've got a lot of native diversity. They're very interesting to me because I get to think of how species coexist and because I care about conservation. So I value them. I spend a lot of time working in them. Of course, a lot of grasslands are used for production. So they're often working landscapes. And so some of my work I would call more applied in that I work with ranchers in terms of how to increase and stabilize forage production or prevent invasive species. But again, this comes down to who's on the land, who they value, and we maybe bring different values to the table. And then finally, what I want to talk about today is some work that I've started since I moved to the University of Oregon. And this is kind of thinking about hazelnut orchards. So this was a departure for me, but this was a new way of thinking about a system in that the ideas were really generated in partnership with the people on the land. And so I would call this sort of a translational approach, and I want to dive into the type of research that we took. But I think what I want to emphasize is who and how questions are asked matters. If we don't have people on the table asking the right questions, often our science doesn't translate into good practice. So a translational approach comes from the idea of translational medicine. So if you take a doctor and a patient, the doctor has really good specialized knowledge. They went to medical school, they know their stuff. But on the other hand, the patient has knowledge that the doctor can't access. They've lived in their body their whole lives. They're an expert on their own body. And so the idea of translational medicine is we get the best medical outcomes if we bring both of these knowledge forms to the table and respect them. In the same way for translational ecology, the idea is that you get better outcomes if you bring ecologists, stakeholders, and decision makers together to work through the entire scientific process together from idea generation through towards the final outcome. And so this would be a very collaborative and engaged approach that requires building long-term trust and having good communication between partners. A translational approach then might be that academics and stakeholders sit down and discuss what are environmental problems, and that knowledge could flow from both ways. But then stakeholders could say, hey, listen, these are the social and policy constraints I'm operating with. So maybe you scientists have some sort of optimal idea for what you think needs to be done, but it's just not going to work given the realities of of our constraints. So by using those two different forms of knowledge, we can say, okay, what would be, a good path forward? And then academics can maybe provide some funding or experimental design to assessing this. Stakeholders might also be able to provide resources. So I work a lot in the field. Maybe they have land that we can use or other forms of inputs into the process. And then working together, we can start to answer our questions and develop new ones. So the kind of first dip into working as a translational ecologist in Oregon for me was a conversation I had with Taylor Larson from My Brother's Farm, which is converting conventional grass seed towards organic hazelnuts in Cresswell. Taylor and I sat down and we were just sort of talking about how he manages his land. And he said, you know, pests are a really big challenge for hazelnut growers. And in particular, there's this moth called the filbert worm that gets into hazelnuts. And if too many hazelnuts are infested, processors won't even deal with you. And so when you're doing an organic farm, what you need to do is keep the ground very clear and get all the nuts off the ground. Because if you get all the nuts off the ground, you'll get the infested nuts too. You'll break the life cycle of the moth. However, the kicker is that this is a native moth. It's actually hosted by the Oregon white oak, which is of high conservation value. We've lost all but 5% of our oaks. And so we sat down and we're like, how do we deal with the fact that these moths might be coming in from neighboring oak stands? So we want to keep our oaks, but we also want to have our organic hazelnuts pest-free. So we thought, okay, well, let's think about the life cycle of this moth. And Taylor was like, I have some pigs and pigs like to eat acorns. So what if we run these pigs through the oak stands, they'll eat the infested acorns and then they'll break the life cycle of the moth. And I thought, I would never have thought about this problem or this approach, but let's do it. You know, I'm a scientist, I have experimental design. Let's put this into practice. So started this approach and we said, okay, there's this problem of pests coming from hazelnuts, are coming from oaks, but we don't want to use pesticides and maybe we can try pigs. I got a seed grant through the environmental studies program, put together an experimental design, and then brought my grad student Alejandro and undergrads Cal and Drew on board to be starting to study this question from different angles. For his part, Taylor provided the lands and pig and implemented the labor. So they moved the fences and moved the pigs. And what we found was indeed by using pig grazing in his oak stands, we were reducing pest pressure into his hazelnuts. So it was a really viable strategy. Of course, by spending time together, we had a whole bunch of new questions, and this has resulted in a larger USDA grant. We also brought on some more stakeholders. So now we're working with conventional farms as well, thinking about, okay, if hazelnuts are where oaks used to be, can we get more of the conservation value that we had in our oak stands by, say, having native cover crops in our hazelnuts? So now we have a whole new research team that involves Marissa and Anna looking at the potential for bringing back some of the understory diversity as well. So again, all of these questions were ones that I never would have occurred to me as a grassland ecologist, but by working with these partners, we're starting to bring more conservation value to these lands. So in conclusion, I would say a translational approach provided, one, interesting questions that I didn't know to ask, but I've got real into both the epistemic side of these questions as well as the applied. Second, it gave us policy relevant research outcomes, and the process itself improved the environment. We reduced pests on Taylor's land as part of this experiment. It also provided opportunities for students to develop into independent researchers. And I would say doing a translational approach is often very place-based. You need to be building your relationship with stakeholders. And by having it be local, it gave a lot of opportunities for undergrads to take the reins of different dimensions of the projects and really flourish. And then finally, we got greater outreach by engaging users throughout the process. So they were invested in knowing about our results and then disseminating them. And with that, thank you so much. And it was really a pleasure to share just a slice of some of our research. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hallett. Our next speaker is Dr. Doug Toomey.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jill, and thanks, Adele, for inviting me to speak here. And thanks for the people that are attending for listening to these presentations. My name is Doug Toomey, and I'm the director of the Oregon Hazards Lab in the Earth Sciences Department. And the mission of the Oregon Hazards Lab is to use science, technology, and community engagement to understand, detect, and mitigate multi-hazards within the Pacific Northwest. I really want to make 3 points in today's talk. Is that the urgency of societal needs is building infrastructure to support hazards detection and alerting of the public. The second is that infrastructure will support environmental education, research, and public service. And its success in this broad area requires direct engagement with policymakers, regional stakeholders, and the public. In the Oregon Hazards Lab, 2 of our fundamental programs are the Earthquake Early Warning System for the West Coast, referred to as Shake Alert, which is now available for the public all along the West Coast, and you should have it on your phone if you don't already. And our second project is Alert Wildfire, which is mountaintop pan-tilt zoom cameras for early fire detection and suppression. The major goals of these efforts are to provide the public for early warning and alerting of hazards in the region, but also importantly for the stakeholders and our lifelines that we have throughout the region to make sure that we can reduce the hazards to the lifeline infrastructure. This graph shows two of the reasons why we chose those hazards, and this is from the Oregon Health Authority, and it's the Oregon's Public Health Hazard Vulnerability Assessment. Along the vertical axis is the 5-year hazard probability, and along the horizontal axis is the public health consequences. And what you can see is one of our most frequent hazards in the Pacific Northwest is wildfire, and we know that all too well from the past few years. If you look along the x-axis and you go, or the horizontal axis, and you go from minimal effect to something that overwhelms the system, what you can see is the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami was actually placed to the right of an emerging disease, and we don't have to think anymore about an emerging disease and its impact on what it's done for us in the past year. This graph was made in 2013, and I'm sure that if we made it today in 2021, our most frequent hazard in the Pacific Northwest would start moving further and further to the right. We're in a situation now where every year we can expect wildfires throughout the West and are having devastating consequences on the public, on the water and air we drink, and on people's livelihoods. The second point I'd like to make is that the infrastructure will support environmental education, research, and public service. And there's really a lot of different avenues for participation of students and the public in these efforts. The OHAS team deploys sensors throughout the Pacific Northwest. So if you're interested in field work, electronics, mechanical engineering, any aspect of working in the field to deploy sensors, there's tremendous opportunities there. We're involved in real-time technologies for the Shake Alert system, which is really remarkable. We have to deliver real-time data to 3 data centers in Seattle, Menlo Park, and Los Angeles in under 1 to 2 seconds. So the cyber infrastructure, the IT networking, if you're a computer scientist or interested in technology of how wireless devices work, that's a tremendous opportunity. All these sensors in the field, whether we're using it for earthquakes, wildfire, or other sorts of environmental research we're beginning on water quality and forest health, allows the domain scientists throughout the natural sciences at the University of Oregon to participate. And so there's really no, if you can think of something interesting to monitor the environment, our presence throughout the state and delivery of real-time data can be very useful to you. Lastly, we want to make our science actionable. We don't want to just simply publish papers and get a higher H index. We'd like to inform the public and the stakeholders of what's going on. And that requires that we deliver alerts to the public. And in that case, it really requires that social scientists be involved in that, because you don't want me, a seismologist, deciding how the public should be alerted. There's issues there of equity, there's issues there of effective communication that really has to be done by the social science community. Likewise, there's a number of issues in public policy. I've had interesting discussions with lawyers about access to mountaintop infrastructure. There's just a cross-cutting theme through monitoring our environment from the technological side to the actionable information that really can provide a lot of opportunities for students and faculty across the campus. The last point I'd like to make is that such success in such a broad effort requires engagement with policymakers, regional stakeholders, and the public. In the last 5 years, the OHAS team has traveled from Harney County to Lincoln County, from Portland to Ashland. We've gotten our teeth kicked in all over the state, working with stakeholders, learning how to communicate with them, how to work with emergency managers, fire departments, and importantly, with our champions throughout the state. Governor Brown shown here, but also our legislators in Salem and in DC have been great champions of building resiliency in our region. I want to point out that Governor Brown published a policy agenda, Resiliency 2025, just before her re-election 2018, which was called Improving Our Readiness for the Cascadia Earthquake and Tsunami. And if you read through that, you'll see that the governor has directed the state's resilience officer to implement a statewide emergency warning system by 2023 that ties together multi-hazard events, earthquakes, wildland fires, landslides, and flooding events. We're working on projects to implement that now in the Mackenzie and Santiam corridors, and also in the Rogue Valley area, the 3 areas that were hit by the historic fires of last year, to try and provide early warning in those regions, and also to monitor more than just earthquakes and wildland fires, but also the landslide events we can expect to happen in those corridors in the coming years. With that, I'll close and say thank you. And if you're interested in anything from field work to outreach to the public, please contact us at the Oregon Hazards Lab.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Dr. Ali Reyes Santos.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am Alair Reyes Santos. I teach in the Department of Indigenous and Racial Ethnic Studies, and I'm the Associate Director of the Just Futures Institute for Climate and Racial Justice at University of Oregon. Today, I speak from Eugene, Oregon, in Kalapuya, Ilihi, the ancestral homeland of the Kalapuya peoples, about the Oregon Water Futures Project. I begin by asking Ara, the land, Omi, the waters, and Egun, the ancestors, for permission to speak today about this project. And I ask that each one of us recognizes the indigenous stewards of the waters, wherever we find ourselves, and the ancestral histories of all the peoples displaced by slavery, indentureship, and migration that have come to call Oregon home. I hope that our conversations open roads for water justice for all. The Oregon Water Justice Water Futures Project is a collaborative that aims to impact how the future of water in Oregon is imagined through storytelling, capacity building, relationship building, policy making, and community-centered advocacy at the state and local level. We center the voices of communities underrepresented or historically discriminated against in water policy decision-making, particularly Native, people of color, migrant, and low-income communities. Our coordination team in 2021 includes University of Oregon, Oregon Environmental Council, Coalition of Communities of Color, Willamette Partnership, and Verde. And our research partners are Chinook Indian Nation, Pecun, Yuval Cree, Unite Oregon, and NWCP Eugene Springfield. In fall 2020, we undertook interviews and online community gatherings over the phone and Zoom with people in Clatsop, Marion, Polk, Clackamas, Umatilla, Malvern, Lane, and Multnomah counties. Yesterday, we had our first press conference launching these findings, and today, actually, at exactly this time, we're launching our report of findings on our website. You can find it at OregonWaterFutures.org. There you can also find 2-page summaries of the report, because the report is 100-page long. So if you want the short version of it, you can find it on our website as well in 6 different languages. Please share with everyone who wants to talk about water justice in the state. I hope you see in the slide that I note here as one of the lead authors, Cheyenne Holiday. Cheyenne Holiday was actually a student intern and project manager of this project at the university, and she supervised a number of student interns who made this project possible as well. And really want to highlight their work, because without Cheyenne doing this work with us, both as a student at the university and afterwards staying in our team through this year, this project and this report wouldn't be possible. Other interns include Ava Alkan, Megan Johnson Guthrie, Grace Brawler, who's now working Beyond Toxics as a policy expert on water and other kinds of environmental policy. Evelyn Easton Kohler, who's now working actually at Verde, doing water justice work as well, and communications work for them. Callie Hudson, Katie Moreland, who's currently in the law school student working as well on water justice and environmental issues, and Ida Shibiro. All of these students produced research snapshots that allow us to think about what kinds of questions we could ask relevant to water justice in different counties, being really mindful about the specific needs and cultural realities and the demographic realities of the communities that we were surveying and talking to. Now, today, what I'll do is I'm going to share very briefly a few of the research findings that are actually currently being considered by legislators at the state and federal level as we think of ways for the state to invest in water justice. And as I hear my colleagues before me, I can see ways in which we can collaborate around some of these issues as well. So I can't wait to talk to my colleagues more about some of these. The first finding that we're actually now engaging people in conversation about is that we must invest in capacity building with culturally specific organizations and engage Native, Indigenous, Latin American, Latinx, Black, migrant, and other communities of color leadership in the design and facilitation of community engagement around water. And this is a priority. Something that we really want to emphasize is the need for that community partnership piece that my colleagues previously established as a way to actually successfully implement water justice projects and policies. These communities are water experts with the capacity to help the state address water challenges. Interviewees share with us what they know about how to best care for water. Native, Indigenous, Latin American, Black, and migrant communities from the Caribbean, Asia, East Africa, the Pacific Island, and the Middle East share with us how they pass culturally specific values and traditional ecological knowledge to their children. They know that water is sacred, a finite resource, and must be cared for. Migrant communities in particular wish to learn more about Oregon ecosystems, where their drinking water comes from, if they can trust it, and how to best advocate for water resources. So an investment in that kind of capacity building would prove really fruitful. The second finding has to do with domestic wells and household wells. So funding for household well testing, treatment and replacement, as well as septic system replacement and repairs are really essential. People talk to us about having dirty water that was just not potable in multiple locations throughout the state. And there's possibilities for funding that right now. Our third finding, which speaks to the questions raised by the Hazards Lab, has to do with emergency notification systems and how it is that they must reach non-English speaking, low-income, tribal and rural residents. A lot of the people we talked to were quite terrified in the last wildfire season for lack of information, lack of resources to care for their families, or to evacuate as needed, and also during the recent algae blooms in 2018 in the Salem area as well. Another finding has to do with ensuring that fire recovery funds and other funds reach very small water systems, which usually fall through the cracks of different kinds of water policy and funding. We found that, for example, small water systems that provide water for mobile home parks and employer-provided housing in farms have inconsistent access to potable drinking water. And when we talk about inconsistent, it's really scary access to, or not lack of access to potable drinking water. Lastly, we want to keep emphasizing that low-income rural communities of color must be intentionally engaged in all kinds of water decision-making, policy-making, and funding and investment areas by the state. Otherwise, we risk creating programs, information, funding sources that continue to be inaccessible to those communities as well. And we would like to end by thanking all the people who made it possible for us to do this project, to have the resources to bring students on board, to have the books, the research that we needed to make it happen, and in particular, the University of Oregon Center for Latin American Studies, the Waymore Center for Law and Politics, and our partners to this day, the Center for Environmental Futures, that has been quite significant for the success of this project as well. I look forward to your questions and to talk about the next steps of this project that are growing right now through the Mellon Foundation, Just Futures Institute at the University of Oregon. And we are already foreseeing and recruiting students to work with us for that next stage. Thank you for being with us today.
Many thanks to you, Dr. Reyes Santos. Our next speaker is Dr. John Arroyo.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen okay? Great. Thank you for that segue, Dr. Reyes Santos. I'm here to talk about the Pacific Northwest Just Futures Institute for Racial and Climate Justice. And this is a very exciting transformation that's about to occur here on our campus and across the Pacific Northwest. And today I'll just be giving you a brief overview about what we will be doing over the next 3 years with this institute and how it came about. The mission of the Pacific Northwest Just Futures Institute is really applied research, open access projects, and capacity building writ large, thinking about how all of the emerging climate and racial justice issues are interconnected and how this can best serve underrepresented populations, most of which have not been a part of this conversation. This came about in early January through a large grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that had started a national Just Futures initiative. And so the University of Oregon is one of 16 other grantees, and we received about $4.5 million. So over the next 3 years, we will be doing this type of work under our host, the Center for Environmental Futures. Our other partners on this project include the University of Idaho in Walla Walla, in Moscow, Idaho, Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and various community organizations. And our partnership here includes the Eugene main campus, as well as the campus in Portland as well. We've got 13 departments across the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Design, and 12 campus-wide offices also assisting in the partnership here. And our leadership team includes me as the director, Dr. Reyes Santos as the associate director, and various other faculty here, Stephanie Lemenager in English, Mark Carey in environmental studies, Marcia Weisiger in history, and Laura Pulido in Indigenous race and ethnic studies. This is just a brief list of our campus-wide offices and our programs here. So let me start with the main units that are part of this within the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Design. And I'll just highlight a few, what we would figure with environmental studies being deeply connected in this, the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management, Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, but we also have history and English and geography and architecture, historic preservation, anthropology, law, the Honors College, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the School for Architecture and Environment. Alongside all of those disciplinary units, we also have various campus-wide offices. Our host at the Center for Environmental Futures, but also the Climate Change and Indigenous Peoples Initiative, the Collaborative for Inclusive Urbanism, the Critical Race Lab, Infographics Lab, Labor Education Research Center, the Glacier Lab, and various other groups that span any specific unit, the Student Center for Sustainability, the UO Office for Sustainability, Tribal Climate Change Project, and the UO Digital Scholarship Services. And the important thing here is that as we think about how we approach in the 21st century any issue dealing with race and climate, it's really difficult to think just between disciplinary boundaries or even methodological boundaries, and really pushing the bill to make sure that we can say various units are working on these themes. How can we work together and collaborate across our campus, across our various campuses, and across our entire region in the Pacific Northwest? Seeing that this is a fertile ground for thinking about race, but also thinking about climate and all of its intersections. We have 8 key project themes that we will be focusing on over the next 3 years. These include academic incentives that will increase the pipeline for postdocs, visiting scholars, staff, and underrepresented students. We will be doing several projects focusing on economic dignity through research and experimental pedagogy, mostly open access projects, including an atlas. We will be looking at the future of ice and society and climate justice beyond the natural sciences, but thinking about the social sciences and the humanities and who these themes affect. We'll be looking at Indigenous lifeways and increasing undergraduate populations from various tribal groups around the region as potential students here, but also participating in our various partnerships that already exist. We'll be doing work on equity-based planning and looking at issues of gentrification in Black communities, as well as other storytelling projects and fieldwork projects with our Sustaining Inclusive Cities theme. Ali Reyes Santos will be leading our Afro-Indigenous healing theme with some of the work that she just went through and her Caribbean Women Healers project. And our partners at Idaho will be working on an atlas about fire and climate justice. And Whitman College will focus on a new program for undergraduates looking at the future of the eastern parts of rural Oregon and Washington. Our deliverables are fourfold. We'll be focusing on research from scholarships to internships, grad student positions, dissertation fellowships, artist residencies, stipends, and faculty fellowships. We'll be doing a series of programming that will be very exciting with our field schools, our architectural design studios, and our media labs. We've got a series of open access publications, including an atlas for essential work, a new report, an update to a former report on immigration in Oregon, a story map project in Portland, and also looking at historical landmarkers and other digital humanities projects. And we'll end all of this with a summative symposia about the future of work and climate in lifeways in the Pacific Northwest, as well as one on white nationalism and looking at the demographic realities that affect both climate and race. In conclusion, most of this work will have various opportunities for entry points, whether you're a graduate student, undergraduate, faculty, or community partner. We also have a lot of attention from various state and local officials in the region. Our main interest here is looking at how the future of community engaged humanities scholarship can be transformed at a place like the University of Oregon that we really think can be the place in the 21st century, the center to study race and climate, and the ways to instigate cultural change from that. We are developing a set of research justice principles to make sure that all of our work is ethical and our dissemination practices follow suit, and that we decolonize all of the traditional university community relationships that have really defined a lot of work in higher education thus far. And a lot of this work also goes to frame the recruitment principles and thinking about the demographic transformation and the future of how the UO can and will remain a leader in this field. So if you have any questions, I welcome you to look at our website here, or you can connect with Rachel Lee, our coordination GE. As we're ramping up, we really look forward to being in touch and sharing with you all of the great findings, projects, and opportunities we have coming by.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Arroyo. Our next speaker is Dr. Holly Smith.
All right, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Holly Smith. I'm an assistant professor of science and environmental communication, and I'm an applied social science researcher, and my work focuses on communication dimensions of science and environmental issues like wildfire and earthquakes, climate change, and alternative energy transition. Prior to joining the University of Oregon, I was a faculty member at the University of Rhode Island with a joint appointment in communication and marine affairs. Here at the University of Oregon, I'm affiliated with the Center for Science Communication Research. The Center for Science Communication Research was created in 2017, and it's housed in the School of Journalism and Communication. At SCR, as we call it, we do our work at the intersections and at the boundaries. So we're researchers and we're communicators, we're scientists and we're problem solvers. And we fundamentally believe that listening is just as important as informing and talking. And our mission is to make complex science useful to improve people's lives. And we have 5 key focal areas: environmental communication, which I'm going to talk about today, health communication, judgment and decision-making, science and technology, and creative inquiry. For the area of environmental communication, we conduct interdisciplinary research and we engage in evidence-based education for several environmental issues, including natural hazards, climate change, and environmental policy. I'm going to focus on one issue today, and that's the issue of wildfire. So there are several scholars within SCR and the School of Journalism and Communication who are studying wildfires in the Western United States and how the complexities of that issue are being communicated about and understood. And one example of this is a research project that we just completed, and it brought together researchers from UO's Institute for Sustainable Environment, SCR, Oregon State University, Colorado State University, and the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. It had scholars from sociology, forestry, communication, public policy, and anthropology. We studied how wildfire risks and solutions were defined and communicated in media coverage, policy documents, and community planning documents for a specific fireshed. The goal of the project was to see how different groups were talking about wildfire risks and solutions, and find opportunities to create shared meaning in an effort to increase capacity for shared governance. The way we define terms and communicate about environmental issues directly impacts the way we manage resources and create policy. This research also informs the way we engage with our students and the courses that we teach. For example, in 2019, I was able to teach an honors college course called Science and Environmental Communication in the Age of Wildfires in the West. In that class, students were able to explore how fire is impacting life in Lane County. We engaged with emergency managers and fire personnel to talk about the communication dynamics around fire here. We also explored what individuals and communities were doing to prepare for future fire seasons in our own community. Another example is the creation of the Fire Story podcast, which was created by SCR faculty this last year in 2020 in response to the wildfire season that we all experienced here in Oregon. The podcast was an experimental way to bring people together and to talk through the science of fire in hopes of answering questions that people encountered during that season about where to go for reliable sources of information, what are our policy options for response, and how as a community can we recover. As these examples show, the work we do is applied, translational, and relevant to our state and region. We want to promote new ways of thinking about professional pathways forward for a changing world. We're doing this by creating and housing innovative programs that explore environmental issues, not only from a research perspective, but also from a creative perspective, and we see that as being critically important. One example of this is the Science and Memory program, which was created by School of Journalism and Communication faculty from the areas of journalism and advertising. The program offers undergraduate students an opportunity every summer to go and live in Cordova, Alaska, with faculty members and partner organizations, and they get to explore how to tell the story of climate change and what climate changing is doing to life there and how that affects life here for us. Students have produced award-winning pieces of creative work as a result of this program and are finding new ways to envision their professional careers. We are constantly asking and exploring questions of how to communicate environmental issues in ways that are both scientifically accurate, but also incredibly socially engaging. In short, environmental issues are fundamentally linked to communication because the act of communication shapes how we view, understand, and interact with the environmental and social systems in which we live. The work we do embodies the principles of the Environment Initiative and its multidimensional, interdisciplinary, and applied approach. Our goal at SCR really is to do research and teach evidence-based solutions for society's most pressing environmental problems. If you're interested in learning more about the research, the teaching, or the creative work that we're involved in, you can always find more about our center at scr.uoregon.edu. Thank you for the time to speak today.
Thanks so much, Dr. Smith. Our next speaker will be Dr. Kari Norgard.
Wonderful, thank you. It's just, we got to hear when we did our little practice run some of these, but it is so incredibly heartening and exciting to hear and see all of what's happening. And again, Dr. Amos mentioned at the beginning the sort of sense of synergy that comes from all this. And I'm just so honored to be with each of you and excited to hear about your work. And so it's got a value added. I am faculty in sociology and environmental studies. I've been just thrilled. There are so many things that are hard in our world right now on a daily basis for each of us, I'm sure for those listening, and to realize the strength and the goals of this environmental initiative is very heartening for me, as well as to have this opportunity to just see and hear and know and be connected with what you're doing. The work around the idea of livable futures, environmental justice, these are things that have shaped the trajectory of my life. They brought me into the academy. They have shaped the work I do here every day. And so it is very heartening to see amidst all the things that are hard that are happening when people come together and have such good thinking. So I just want to share, I have sort of two areas of work that I'm doing in this. And the first one is about, I think of it as actually related to environmental privilege. It's about climate denial, not in the sense of people saying that climate change isn't happening, but the more widespread way that people who have a lot of power actually are able to collectively ignore it. I'm a sociologist, so I look at this in a very social structural way. And it's very much related to questions about helplessness, despair, collective apathy, these kinds of things. It's also very translatable to many other things that are currently under a lot of discussion in our world, such as how people normalize white supremacy and racism, how privileged white people do, how we normalize the class structure, how we normalize sexual violence against people in our communities, women, these kinds of things. And then the other area, and these areas are connected in a couple of different ways. But the other area of work that I've been doing, and again, both of these have actually been quite long-term and involve undergraduates and graduate students in them. They have a lot of media attention and especially in the case of this one, a lot of policy implications. Right now on the Klamath River, you may have been following, but there are juvenile fish kills happening. The river is very, very dry. And it's pretty intense. So just before I say anything more about this, I just want to acknowledge this is a place where people are really struggling and the river is really struggling. In starting back in '03, I had the privilege of beginning to work with the Kaduk tribe, which is the second largest tribe in California. And that's my main collaborator there, including especially Ron Reed, who I'll show a picture of in a minute. And this work has been initially around the importance of traditional foods in policy process, but also now more recently is very directly linked to climate change. These are just a few of the amazing people, but some of the key ones, several of whom have been students at U of O as well, Kaduk tribal members and other folks within the Kaduk Department of Natural Resources. There in the bottom center is Ron Reed, in particular his youngest son, Ryan Reed, who's here at U of O in environmental studies, and bottom left, and bottom right is Asia Conrad, who got her master's in our environmental studies program 2 years ago. So amidst everything that's hard, I think I've been incredibly blessed to have the opportunity to to one thing, to work with people who are not giving up and who have incredible vision. And so this is an example of this quote from Ron: thinking about climate change, as urgent as it is actually can be the strategic opportunity in which this moment, when what has been visible perhaps for many Indigenous people, many Black people, many people who have been very directly targeted by violence, have not reaped the benefits of the system in the same way that I have, but many of the things that have been visible for many communities are now becoming visible to a larger segment of our society. And in this, there's an opportunity to return again, to pay attention to the wisdom that we already have, especially in this case in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous fire science. And so I've been just really thrilled and delighted to be working most recently, I'll describe this project that again takes these really dire and urgent situations that we have now in terms of what's happening with fire and turning it into a positive or bringing from it positive opportunities for appropriate healing and management. So these are a few images from the National Geographic that recently did a story on my colleague and long-term partner Ron Reed's family. This is one of his sons using cultural burning. Fire is seen as medicine. It's important for healing the landscape. As Ron also talks about, that those activities and the work that one does in the landscape are also about healing in human communities. Certainly, I have been privileged to experience healing in my life from all the work that I do. And so the idea is been central to the work, most recently part of the Kaduk Climate Adaptation Plan. Again, these are just images from this area. This is Ron's and his wife Robin's granddaughter running through that recent burn. And so one of the projects I've been doing most recently has to do with the Climate Adaptation Plan, where Indigenous science is very specifically being laid on the table together with Western science This is an article that's sort of showing this, an example of a drawing that one of my graduate students, Kirsten Vignetta, has been doing, using these drawings as ways to communicate Indigenous science in tandem with Western science. So again, this work has involved many, many people, many of whom are U of O students. It's ongoing. We were very excited back when we got started that we hit the front page of the Washington Post, and all that media coverage has made a difference. Folks in the Kaduk tribe have come up to U of O. Here's Ron and his family speaking both at University of Oregon and in our son's class. And I guess we're saving questions for the end, but just again, deep gratitude for the collective energy, and may it go well for all of us, and serve and support our students to create healing in our lives. Yotva.
Thanks so much, Dr. Norgard. Our final speaker is Dr. Shannon Butcher.
Hi, I'm Shannon Butcher in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry here at the University of Oregon, and also the founding director of the Oregon Center for Electrochemistry. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in the context of storing large amounts of energy for 100% renewable energy economy. So just some quick background data. Okay, so this is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere going back 1 million years. So most people know about CO2 being a driver of climate change, but many people haven't actually seen the data. So this is actually data collected from trapped gas and ice cores up to the near era where we can directly measure it in the air. And what you see here is the CO2 concentrations have essentially doubled from their historical average over the last 1 million years. And this is all unequivocally human caused. The other nice piece of data, or chilling piece of data perhaps, is that the temperature, the land temperature, really has changed dramatically over the last 150 years. And there's lots of drivers for this, and one of them is CO2, warming induced by CO2. So we've gone up by over 2 degrees Celsius on average for the land-based temperature in the world. Okay, so where does all the CO2 come from? We know that it comes from fossil fuels. You can break it down into different industrial, transport, buildings, electricity sectors, but the challenge is, how do you replace all this fossil fuel energy with a completely renewable energy? Okay, and there's been tremendous progress in this area, actually. And so I'll just show one of the aspects, and that's this cost of solar electricity. So electricity from solar photovoltaics, from solar cells. This is a logarithmic plot that plots the cost per watt. It's a production amount of electricity produced versus the magnitude of the industry. So how many panels are being made. And what you see is it's coming down linearly on this log scale. So every time you increase the production by a factor of 10, you decrease the cost by a certain percentage. And so right now, it turns out that electricity from solar panels in relatively sunny places are cheaper than any other form of electricity on the planet. Okay, so this is amazing. This is amazing progress. And this is something that I think most of us in the field would have thought 20 years ago was impossible. And we're there. Okay, but what's the big challenge? And folks know this intuitively, right? It's not always sunny. So there's been some nice studies of the intermittency of energy resources and demand. And what you see is essentially obvious. There's a day-to-day intermittency, right? Because the sun doesn't shine at night. You need ways to store electricity for air conditioning in the evenings, for running factories at night. And that actually can largely be done by advanced batteries. And the battery technology is also progressing tremendously and on a similar curve to the solar technology. That's actually largely a solved problem. In the next 10 years, that will be coming online. The bigger challenge is actually what we call long duration storage. And one of the long duration storages is, for example, the fact that renewables will generally overproduce during one part of the year and underproduce, for example, in the late summer in the Northern Hemisphere when there's large demand. So how do you shift over months? Batteries aren't good at storing energy over months of time. They discharge, they're expensive, they take up a lot of space. So how do you do that? So one of the best ways to do that is actually hydrogen. So we may have heard about the hydrogen economy. You can do a lot with hydrogen. So hydrogen can be made many ways. The green way to make hydrogen is to use water and to split the water into hydrogen and oxygen gas. The oxygen gas can be released, and I'll talk about that today. Once you have the hydrogen, there's a tremendous number of things you can do with it. You can turn it back into electricity using a fuel cell or burn it like natural gas. In fact, hydrogen will likely displace natural gas in our economy in the next 20 years. Hydrogen can be used to make fertilizer. 1% of the world's energy right now goes to making ammonia fertilizer from nitrogen. That can be done with hydrogen, metals, heating, synthetic fuels, hydrogen vehicles for large scale shipping. And this is happening too, but there's more technical challenges to make this work. But there are companies now with plans, concrete plans, designs, and prototypes being built to fly airplanes, hydrogen-based jets and prop planes, long distance trucking and shipping from, for example, Asia to the US. Those will all be driven by hydrogen. So where do we get this hydrogen from and how do we do it? This is one of the things we're working on here at Oregon. I'll tell you a few little research snippets in a moment. So this is a device picture of an electrolyzer that actually forms hydrogen fuel at high rate, in this case using electricity, renewable electricity, say from a solar panel, as the input. Basically 2 reactions. You need to take protons and add electrons to make hydrogen, but then you have to get those protons from somewhere, and where you get them from is from water. And in order to do that, you need to make oxygen. And it turns out that making the oxygen is actually the hardest part in this whole process. Making the hydrogen, this is actually a fast reaction chemically. So at Oregon here in our center, we have a number of programs in this area spanning from very fundamental to applied and working with companies. In one case, we've been studying how to improve the reaction for making oxygen to lower the wasted energy in making the hydrogen. And we've been looking at a class of materials called layered double hydroxides, oxyhydroxides, and trying to understand exactly which elements there do the catalysis. We use advanced analytical techniques. Here's a image or a video of a catalyst particle operating. When it's operating, the surfaces are very dynamic and the particles change shape. And this is all critically important for understanding them. This is about 100 times smaller than a human hair. We've also been leveraging this deep understanding to look at advanced electrolyzer systems that are able to make hydrogen at large scale. Many of the current systems use expensive precious metals like platinum and iridium, which we will run out of, or they'll become too scarce if you really scale this technology to where we need to go. So some of the next generation systems are using things like iron and nickel, steel in their systems. There's a lot of challenges with doing this, and we're working with several companies to do this. Finally, I'll mention just a new project that we're working on where we can use electrochemistry to actually make acid and base using something called a bipolar membrane. Turns out there's a lot of interest in this. You can use base like you would have in Drano, like a drain cleaner, right? It can actually capture CO2 from the atmosphere. So a lot of interest in using these types of systems to capture CO2 and do chemistry on. So with that, I'll end. I'll point you to our website, electrochemistry.uoregon.edu, which describes our goals, really to have a world-leading research program that span basic to applied science, working with companies, national labs, and international teams, and really focusing on unique graduate education. We actually have the only graduate program focused on electrochemistry. You can come here and take 6 courses in electrochemistry. Undergraduates can take some of those courses as well. And we hope our outcomes have a big impact on the university and the world as a whole. Thank you for listening.
Thanks. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to thank Dr. Butcher and open the floor for questions.
So I'm going to kick us off with questions. I want to thank all of you for joining this first one. I'm going to start with Holly, Lauren, and Shannon to answer this one. And then feel free to, others can jump in as well. But I'd love for each of you to just quickly reflect on what disciplines your work requires you to engage that are outside of yours, right? So where have you found yourself needing to reach across disciplinary lines or interact with folks, or in the process of being engaged with communities, you found, wow, I'm getting a set of questions that aren't deeply rooted in my own training, and so I have to reach into different spaces. So I don't know who would like to take that one first, but I'd love to kick that to Holly and Lauren and Shannon. one of you want to jump in on that question?
From Sarah, the question from Sarah.
No, the question I just asked. We're going to do Sarah's next.
I see.
Yep.
I can take a stab.
Great. Thanks, Holly.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for communication, we're a social science discipline, and we need other social science disciplines as well. From everything from history and the humanities to sociology and anthropology. With environmental issues, so much of communication is based in culture and language. And so we really rely on scholars from those fields. Also, incredibly important is working with natural scientists that we don't have that knowledge of, the environmental systems. And so thinking about that, we really have to be able to work with people from a wide range of disciplines, other social scientists, but then also natural scientists who really understand the natural systems, and hopefully that we can communicate as a team, which is always a process in and of itself. And it's a learning experience for us as communication scholars to work with people from other disciplines. So a wide variety. And then also beyond that is just working with people who are actually doing this in their daily lives. So like emergency managers, people who are resource managers, people who are working with the public, working with external stakeholders that are outside of academia is incredibly important for us as well.
Thanks, Holly.
I can answer from my perspective. So our lab is a restoration ecology lab, but I think we go in our collaborations kind of both deeper into the natural sciences and then into the social sciences and humanities. So for example, some of the questions that we ask, we're dealing with how resource dynamics are changing plant communities. And so we end up working in chemistry as well. And, we also work with kind of going at scales of organizations. So we work with population genetics, moving up to how that affects populations and then communities. So kind of into the natural sciences, it's having collaborations and some literacy across those disciplines really helps our work. On the other side of things, the social sciences. So kind of thinking about that Hazelnut project, right now we're working with social scientists to poll different growers and see what are their constraints for doing work. And so being able to work with them. And also the humanities and particularly history. And so from a restoration ecology perspective, kind of what do we restore ecosystems to? Is it really kind of, how do you answer that question? Like what point in history is the point that we go back to, right? And so thinking about kind of the history of how lands have been used, what did it look like under Indigenous stewardship? What does it look like now? How do we think about those values? And so kind of through history and actually also philosophers. Yeah, that was broad, but there we go.
Thank you, Lauren. And Shannon, I'm happy to have you answer that question or shift to Sarah's, but maybe just, related. Yeah, go ahead, great.
I think they're related. So Sarah asked a very important question. And that is, what are the potential human rights or social justice concerns that the public should know about as hydrogen or more broadly renewable energy technologies become the dominant source of energy? And these are things I think about, but I don't have answers to, and these are things where social scientists and others, policymakers are incredibly important. Science can provide technology, well, science and engineering leads to technology, but how that's applied, is a really a tough question. So, for example, should our policy be to incentivize people to buy electric cars when electric cars are twice as much right now and largely luxury cars, right? That basically only advantage people with lots of money. But on the other hand, they kickstart an electric car industry that eventually will benefit everyone. So how do you apply those in an equitable way? I don't know the answer. I haven't thought about it deeply enough to give you a thoughtful answer. I have sort of unformed, I have opinions, right, on how this stuff. Other questions is, where do you put solar panels? Where do you put them? Do you put them they're not going to be in people with lots of money's backyard typically, right? So we're probably not going to have, fill the golf courses over here on, across the street from my house here in Eugene with solar panels, right? Because that's not, we'll put them somewhere else in rural areas or, so how do we do that? How do we do that in a fair and equitable way? I have a feeling we won't, but we need to do our best. and I think that's where everybody needs to kick in. And it's a really great area to get involved in, because what we're going to see is the biggest transformation in any industry, really since, the Industrial Revolution. It's sort of like a second industrial revolution, akin to like the IT revolution we've seen. It's going to be a dramatic shift in the next 20 or 30 years.
That's great. And I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on this question of to sort of what, disciplines or areas that are outside your own expertise that you feel like you need to engage. Certainly one of the goals of the Environment Initiative on the U of O's campus is to help build those bridges, so Shannon, tried to help facilitate you being connected with people who can begin to answer those questions, right? And to be supportive and to create a university that is supportive of those kinds of interactions. So if anybody else wants to reflect on that, and then a question too for the group. No takers on the disciplinary question? I'll offer just from my own research perspective too. Holly, you mentioned this, the work that's associated with learning to speak across disciplinary lines, because we've all been trained in these deep disciplines, is real work and takes real time. I've been on a team that 5 years into it, we realized that when we were saying the word drought, we all meant something different. And we were 5 years in before we realized we didn't have a common definition of the word drought. So, so those are very real challenges. And I think it's really incumbent upon higher ed to work in those spaces, to use our creative capacity in that regard. So the second question I'd like to ask, and I'd love to focus this one on Doug and Ali and Kari and John. And that is, in the work that you do, what kinds of new professional pathways do you see emerging? Like when you think about the kinds of work that you're doing that is multidisciplinary, that is engaged externally, what are the pathways that you see opening up for students to work in the world that are that may not have been there when we were all in pursuing our education? I'd love for you just to reflect a bit on that. Yes, Ali, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah,
like, Carrie,
I should call people directly. Yeah.
I'll say this from working on this project for the past 2 years with students and seeing them get jobs doing facilitation with communities of color, low-income communities, queer communities, communities with disabilities around housing, environmental justice. Definitely, and a professional pathway has to do with, if you learn how to work with historically marginalized, underrepresented, discriminated communities, there's new possibilities for doing that kind of community engagement work that I don't think was there even 5 years ago, right? Like there's been like this like uptake of like a need for people to have that kind of training. And definitely training students to do that work has been really amazing. And to see them placed in different locations to have those conversations. I think definitely going back to the question of interdisciplinarity, and I think for students out there to think in those terms is really useful, because in our team, we had students from sciences, environmental studies, journalism and communications. Holly, if I had known, I would have connected Ava with you. From the law school, right? From ethnic studies, from Spanish and language and culture. So we needed that. Because I'm not an expert on water law and policy and the science of all these things, right, and history. And so there's a way in which students who are interested in entering like kind of like environmental justice fields, thinking about their training in disciplinary ways comes really handy, because when they go for jobs, it opens the road for entering jobs like policy advisor, or what Evelyn is doing right now, communications on environmental issues, right? So it's like having that multiple training, but also there's new professional pathways that allow for that training to be applied in facilitation, community engagement, the field of communications, policy advising, media, digital medias, digital platforms, definitely as ways of doing that kind of work as well. Those are some of the areas that I have noticed in the work that we've done.
Thank you for that. And Kari.
Yeah, thank you. That's a perfect segue. Thank you, Ali. I think, just exactly, there's so many, can you hear me okay? Yeah, somehow my audio changed on my end, but as long as you can hear me. There's so many ways, we see, I was thinking, Alea mentioned organizations. There's so many environmental justice organizations. Tribes are increasingly active in natural resource policy and have a lot of standing and are very involved in capacity. We have more and more Indigenous students coming to universities, and these provides ways of further decolonizing our institutions, which can translate and sort of have a ripple effect in terms of the relationships that then happen, or things that happen here, and how universities interface with communities. So I think those are all really important ways. And I definitely agree, with the sort of the media kinds of ways. I think we are in a time when the world is changing very fast in terms of how we communicate, how we are influenced, and certainly, I mean, each of you know this in so many ways. And so there are constantly opening up these kinds of pathways. And I do think that at the heart of making things possible is relationships, who you have relationships to, really, what are you who are you accountable to? What community, what knowledges, what from your own history, from your own, your own people. I think that can be a base, and as well, similarly, disciplinary, being able to speak across different kinds of disciplinary platforms or languages. That's been really the main thing I would say that I've done. The reason my career has worked as it has is I've been able to be an interface that brings people in contact with each other, that brings ways of knowing, ways of seeing, in contact with each other in ways that can move thinking. So that's my 2 cents. There's more all the time. Having more and more Indigenous students at U of O, having more and more of our students able to work in these different places in our community, it's very powerful.
That's great. Doug, I don't know if you had any thoughts on either of those questions or others that you would like to offer.
Yeah, I do. I guess I'd like to just say I agree with the previous 2 comments, and relationships in particular. And then maybe tell a little story in terms of how OHAS is developed. As a scientist who primarily wrote proposals to the National Science Foundation for many years, OHAS has been very different in that we've really engaged across the state with stakeholders. And so that was a surprise to me of how effective that could be, and that our policymakers were really interested in hearing from scientists. I think one of the problems we have when I look at, say, undergrads or graduate students come into the Earth Sciences department is we're still primarily a discovery-based faculty who writes proposals to the National Science Foundation. But the urgency of public needs are such that we need to build relationships, to reach beyond our comfort zone and go out and talk to all the stakeholders in the state. I mean, really every last one of them, and it takes a lot of time. I said earlier, we got our teeth kicked in. We did, because sometimes pointy-headed scientists are not very good at interacting with policymakers, but we learned how to do that. And so I think building those relationships and then realizing what our limitations are as scientists to reach across to humanists and the social scientists to expand that conversation. I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. And lastly, I'll say, when I look at the group of OHAS, we have several of us participate in the engagement across the state. We have only one dedicated person. And oftentimes I think, well, if we wanted to maximize our impact in the state, we would find some way for the scientists to have more community engagement. And I think that's something where, I look across the people on this screen, I think the campus has that, tremendous strengths in those areas. And the scientists need to be a little more engaging with that community. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Doug. So I'm gonna share my screen really quickly so that folks can see some contact. If anybody's interested in learning more, here's information. We've come to the end of our allotted time today. I want to thank all of you, our faculty presenters. As I said earlier, I knew it would happen. I I was inspired in new ways, and I've heard all of you talk before, so I was inspired in new ways by listening to you today. Hopefully for those who are watching now or will view this later, you have a sense of the incredible breadth and depth of environment-related research that we do here at the U of O. I know I'm proud of it. I'm very excited about what the future holds and the new pods that exist. Professor Norgaard had to log off because of a low battery, I think, but the observation she made about the Indigenous communities that she works with, not giving up on these problems and continuing to work hard is very motivating to me. I want to thank all of those who attended and who asked questions. And I encourage you to please reach out to the folks that are listed here or directly to myself or Jill Elizabeth, who are working with the Environment Initiative now. And I just want to invite you to check out our website and to look and to submit questions and reach out to us and watch for events in this area. And with that, I will close and encourage you all to have a great day. Thanks for coming. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.